My parents spent $250,000 on my sister's wedding, but refused to save my son's life for $95,000. People say love is measured in moments, not money. But I learned the truth the day my parents chose flowers, fireworks, and a 7-tier cake over my little boy's heartbeat. I didn't hate them then, but I never forgot. And years later, when they came back begging, I handed them the answer they once gave me. The story begins in a neighborhood where lawns were trimmed like expectations, and houses pretended to be happier than the people living inside them. I grew up in one of those houses, the kind where silence dressed itself up as peace, and appearances mattered more than feelings. My parents were the architects of that world. They taught us early that reputation was a currency you guarded with both hands and a smile that never cracked. My mother carried refinement the way other women carried purses, always within reach, always on display. My father followed routines as if he'd written them. Breakfast at 7, mail at noon, brandy at 9. They weren't cruel in the obvious way. Their cruelty was softer, quieter. It came wrapped in expectations, in the careful tilting of a chin, in the way their love felt like a prize that needed winning rather than something freely given. My sister Olivia was their masterpiece. She had the kind of beauty that felt curated, glossy hair, perfect posture, a voice always on the edge of laughter. She could cry without smudging her makeup and smile without showing the exhaustion beneath it. They adored her, admired her, invested in her. I learned early that the sun revolved around her needs, and the rest of us rotated in the shadows. But I wasn't jealous. Not then. I was the quiet one, the steady one, the daughter who made herself useful so she wouldn't be a burden. I understood that people played roles, and mine was to disappear gently whenever Olivia entered the room. Life eventually stretched out its hands and carried me away from home. I studied hard, worked harder, married a man who saw me not as a shadow but as a whole person. We built a simple life together, one of thrift store couches, mismatched mugs, and a love that bloomed in the small places. When our son, Henry, arrived, I felt something I had never felt from my parents: unconditional belonging. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine as if he had chosen me, and for once being needed felt like joy instead of obligation. Henry grew into a child whose laughter felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. He had my husband's curiosity and my quiet determination. Some children run through life like they're racing against time. Henry didn't. He moved through the world with the softness of someone trying to make room for everyone else. Even strangers paused to watch him. Something about him made people feel kinder. But life, with its unpredictable storms, doesn't bargain. It happened on an afternoon tinted gold by late autumn light. Henry was 3 years old, a small bundle of wonder-chasing dust particles across the living room. One moment he was laughing, and the next his body folded into itself. A sound escaped him, strangled, wrong. His skin turned a shade no child should ever wear. We rushed him to the hospital in a blur of panic and prayer, and I remember the coldness of the air chair beneath me, the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The diagnosis slid across the air like a blade: a rare cardiac defect, one that had gone unnoticed, one that required immediate surgery. The surgeon explained the risk with a gentle voice, as if softness could cushion the truth. The procedure would buy Henry life, real life, but it came with a cost. Costs we didn't have. $95,000. Our insurance covered the basics but not the specialized procedure, not the equipment, not the surgeon whose hands had saved children across the world. Time wasn't on our side. Every hour we hesitated, Henry's chances slipped away. I remember sitting on the hospital bench beside my husband. He kept rubbing his thumb across his wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd had since college. "We'll find a way," he said. He always found a way, even when the world closed in. But this was bigger. This was a mountain without handholds. We drained our savings. We sold our car. My husband took a loan that barely made a dent. We stood still in the middle of a hurricane with nothing left but one option: my parents. I hadn't asked them for anything in years. They liked it that way. The daughter who didn't need help was easier to love. But that night, sitting beneath a buzzing hospital light that flickered like a dying star, I realized pride was a luxury we could no longer afford. There was no shame in asking your parents to help save their grandson. At least that's what I told myself. So I dialed their number, and every ring felt like a countdown. My mother answered with her usual warm but distant tone. The kind that made you feel welcomed and dismissed in the same breath. I told her everything, the diagnosis, the urgency, the cost. The silence that followed stretched thin and sharp. Let us think about it, she said finally. Think about it. As if Henry's life were a budget item that needed balancing. As if the seconds slipping by weren't slipping towards something irreversible. My father wanted details. Documents. Proof. Facts. Numbers. Their hesitations became small cuts, each one deeper than the last. I tried not to crumble. I tried to pretend that their distance was just shock. But deep inside, a truth I didn't want to name began to stir. They didn't see him the way I did. He wasn't Olivia's child. And yet I waited. I waited because hope turns even the most painful people into possibilities. But while Henry lay in a hospital bed with tubes like tiny lifelines tethering him to the world, my parents were busy, planning Olivia's engagement dinner. A dinner that cost more than the surgery deposit. The night I saw the photos, champagne fountains, crystal linens, a floral arch worth the down payment on a house, I felt something inside me begin to fracture. My parents looked radiant. Olivia sparkled. The caption under the post read, "Celebrating our princess." My son was fighting for breath. Their princess was being celebrated. I swallowed the rising ache and called again. This time my father answered. His tone was clipped, professional, as if we were discussing a business proposal gone wrong. He cleared his throat and delivered the verdict. "We can't, sweetheart. We're already committed financially. Olivia's wedding, it requires a lot. You understand." I didn't. And I never would. But that was the moment greed disguised itself as justification and cruelty pretended to be reason. When the call ended, the world didn't. But something in me did. The night after that call was the longest of my life. The hospital lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a cold, sleepless glow. Machines blinked their steady rhythms, as if trying to remind the world that life, fragile as it was, still clung to Henry's small body. I sat beside him, my fingers gently wrapped around his. His hand was warm but too still, too quiet. Children were supposed to wiggle, to laugh, to demand the world's attention. But mine lay there, fighting a battle he should never have had to face. My husband returned from a vending machine trip with a cup of terrible coffee that smelled like burnt hopes. He sat beside me, placed the cup down, and leaned his forehead into his palms. "Did you call?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. He had watched my posture crumble the moment I put the phone down. "I did," I whispered. "And they said no." He didn't move. He didn't gasp or speak or curse or ask why. Instead, he let the truth settle into him like a weight he had expected but hoped to avoid. He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly, as if inhaling the pain and exhaling the acceptance. "All right," he said finally. "Then we keep going." But I felt something inside me unravel. My parents had turned their backs on us before, but never like this. Never when the stakes were this high. My mind kept replaying the words. We're already committed financially. A wedding. A celebration. A show of beauty and excess. My son's heart was failing, and they were worried about flower arrangements and fireworks. The world felt colder than the air conditioning. The next morning I went outside to breathe. Crisp autumn air cut into my lungs, sharp and cleansing. The sky was heavy with gray, the kind that looked like it carried secrets it refused to reveal. Leaves moved across the pavement like fallen memories. I stood beneath a tree whose branches bent toward me, as if trying to offer comfort the world had withheld. A couple walked past with coffee cups, talking about weekend plans. Their laughter felt like a foreign language I once knew but had long forgotten. I wondered if they could hear the sound of the storm inside me. I wondered if anyone could. The hospital had a small courtyard where exhausted parents went to cry, to pray, to bargain with whatever force might listen. I sat on one of the benches, feeling the wood press into my back. I closed my eyes and whispered a sentence that tasted like surrender. I can't lose him. But life isn't a vending machine. And prayers aren't coins. When I walked back inside, the doctor, a gentleman with a face that carried too many families' grief, approached me. "We need a decision soon," he said. The same sentence he'd spoken before, but now it felt heavier. Final. He placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "We will do everything we can, but his window is narrowing." My throat tightened. I nodded because nodding was the only thing holding my composure in place. Hours passed slowly, painfully. Families of other children shuffled in and out, their faces carrying stories I didn't dare ask about. Nurses moved with practiced empathy. The world went on, as if my universe hadn't stopped. At some point I realized I hadn't eaten. My husband forced a granola bar into my hand. I took one bite and nearly choked on it. Grief has a way of making your body forget how to function. But before the day ended, a notification lit up my phone. A message from my mother. I stared at the screen, the blue bubble glowing like a warning. When I opened it, the words were short, simple, efficient. We love Henry, but this is too much money. We're sorry. Too much money. $250,000 for Olivia's wedding was not too much. Custom chandeliers flown in from Italy were not too much. A designer gown that cost more than my annual salary was not too much. A string quartet, a horse-drawn carriage, imported orchids, a reception hall glittering with gold and self-importance, none of that was too much. But $95,000 to save their grandson? That was too much. I felt something deep inside me close, like a door that had been left ajar for too long. I didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't beg, because when someone shows you exactly how little your pain means to them, anything you say afterward is simply an echo. Late that night, after my husband fell asleep in the chair beside Henry's bed, I stepped out of the room. I walked down the hall until the walls felt far enough away for me to breathe. My vision blurred with tears I had held back too long. Down the hallway, I heard the faint squeal of a cart's wheels and the soft murmur of nurses changing shifts. Life continued its ordinary routines even as mine crumbled at the edges. And then another message came through, this time from my sister Olivia. Mom told me, "I'm so sorry, but you know how weddings are. Everything's already planned. Maybe try a fundraiser." Her words sliced through me with casual sharpness. They weren't meant to wound. They were simply thoughtless, a reflex of someone who never had to measure the world by its cruelty. I didn't respond to her either. Instead, I went back into Henry's room, sat beside him, and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. His eyelashes fluttered slightly, a small movement that felt like a miracle. "Stay," I whispered, not sure if I was speaking to him or myself. "Just stay. The truth is, when you become a parent, you stop making wishes for yourself. Your prayers reshape themselves into your child's name. Your fears stretch into new shapes. Your heart becomes a house with open windows, everything gets in." I stayed awake until dawn. The world outside gradually brightened into a pale morning. Henry stirred, his small chest rising and falling with effort. I kissed his hand, letting my tears fall onto his knuckles. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for heartbreak to settle before knocking, my phone vibrated again. But this message wasn't from my mother. It wasn't from Olivia. It was from someone I hadn't spoken to in a long, long time. A name that carried history. A name my parents avoided in conversations like it was a bruise they didn't want to touch. And as soon as I saw it, the story began to shift in a way none of us could have predicted. The name on my screen looked almost out of place between the bank alerts and medical updates. Uncle Leo. I hadn't seen him in years. Not because distance made it hard, but because my parents made it harder. In our family, disagreements weren't resolved, they were erased. Leo had been the first one to refuse erasure, and for that, he'd been written out. The story, as my parents told it, was simple. Leo was the disappointment. The younger brother who made bad choices, who married for love instead of status, who left the family business to start a repair shop that never looked impressive enough in Christmas photos. There were whispers of stubborn and ungrateful, and eventually his seat at the table vanished as if it had never been there at all. But I remembered him differently. I remembered oil-stained fingers handing me ice cream at a summer fair. I remembered him sneaking me out to watch meteor showers when my parents thought sleep was more respectable than wonder. I remembered his laugh, loud, unrefined, genuine, cutting through the polished quiet of our house like a song that refused to be background noise. And now, after all these years of silence, his name was on my phone. The message was short. "Your dad called me by accident. I heard part of the story. Are you at St. Mary's?" I stared at the screen as the hallway blurred around the edges. My father had called him by accident. The universe, it seemed, still had a sense of irony. My fingers moved before my doubts could stop them. "Yes. Henry's here. It's bad." The three dots appeared almost instantly. then. I'm on my way. There are moments when help doesn't feel like a solution, only a delay in the inevitable. But sometimes just knowing someone is coming shifts the weight of the world by a fraction. Enough for you to breathe again. I went back into Henry's room. The machines continued their steady, indifferent vigil. My husband looked up, his eyes rimmed with the red of sleeplessness. Everything okay? He asked. Someone's coming, I replied. Who? Leo. His brows lifted in recognition. My stories about Uncle Leo had been few but warm. The outcast with the kind heart. The man my parents treated like a cautionary tale but who'd always felt like a secret source of oxygen when I was growing up. Do your parents know? He asked carefully. They will, I said. Or they'll pretend not to. Like they always do. Time in hospitals is measured less in minutes and more in visits, vitals, and the rhythm of footsteps in the hall. We waited. Nurses came and went. Specialists stopped by with an update that wasn't new, only heavier. Henry's numbers were holding, but not for long. The hourglass was still turning. An hour later, I saw him through the glass panel in the door. He looked older, of course. Gray threaded through his hair, lines carved deeper into the corners of his mouth, shoulders bowed with the weight of years that hadn't been cushioned by comfort. But the eyes were the same. Warm. Unapologetically alive. He stepped into the room with the hesitation of a man unsure of whether he is welcome, then relaxed slightly when I stood to hug him. His coat smelled like cold air and machine grease. Familiar. Grounding. He pulled back and looked at me, really looked the way people do when they're comparing the person in front of them with the last memory they have stored away. You grew up, he murmured. I'm still not sure I gave you permission for that. I almost laughed. Almost. His gaze shifted to the bed, to the tiny body half buried in wires and blankets. Everything in his face softened. This is him? He asked quietly. I nodded. This is Henry. He moved closer, careful not to touch anything he shouldn't. Hey little man, he whispered. I've heard a lot about you. Hope you don't mind your granduncle crashing the party. Something in my chest eased. Grief and gratitude have a strange way of holding hands. After a moment we stepped out into the hallway. The sterile walls felt a little less suffocating with someone beside me who wasn't afraid to let emotions show. I called your mother, he said. She hung up on me. Of course she had. What did she say before that? I asked even though I already knew. She said this wasn't my business, he replied. Then she said they had other obligations right now. His jaw clenched. I've heard a lot of cruel things in my life, but that might be in the top 5. The hallway clock ticked too loudly. They're spending $250,000, the words tasting bitter. They said 95,000 is too much to ask. He closed his eyes briefly, like someone absorbing a blow. Your father's always been good with numbers, he said quietly. Shame he never learned how to count what matters. I swallowed hard. We've sold everything we can. There's a fundraiser online, but it's slow. People mean well, but everybody's drowning in their own problems. We're still short. Really short. How much? He asked. I hesitated for a moment. Shame has a way of creeping in even when you know it doesn't belong to you. 71, I said. We've managed to scrape together 24. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor as if expecting to find the answer there. All right, he murmured. Okay, there was a tone in his voice I remembered from long ago, the one he used when a car came into the shop with more wrong than right. A tone that said this will hurt, but I'll fix what I can. He looked back up at me. I don't have that kind of money lying around, he said honestly. But I have a roof. I have tools. I have some savings, not much. And I have people who owe me favors. I'll see what I can move. We'll close some of that gap. Emotion surged up in my throat. You don't have to. Yes, I do. He cut in gently. Not because of them. Because of you. Because of him. Because somebody in this family should remember that grandparent isn't a title, it's a responsibility. Even if I'm doing it from one generation over. His eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. And besides, he added with a faint smile, I'd like to be the kind of man your parents warned you about for better reasons than they think. A laugh escaped me, cracked and wet but real. He spent the rest of the day making calls. I watched him pace up and down the corridor with an intensity that made the fluorescent lights above him flicker in sympathy. He called old friends, former customers, bills he'd quietly reduced when he saw the worry in their eyes. He called the credit union. He called the bank. He called a man named Sammy who once told him, "If you ever need a favor, call me before you decide not to." By evening, his shoulders were sagging with exhaustion, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "I can get you 40, he said. "Maybe 45. It'll cost me almost everything, but I can do it." I stared at him, stunned. 40,000? I repeated. He nodded. "It'll take a day or two to clear some things, but I'll find a way to rush what can be rushed." He sighed. "That still leaves a gap though." 50, I said. "Almost." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Then we make noise," he said. "The kind your parents can't control." We set up the fundraiser properly that night, turning it from a quiet plea into a story. Not a story about tragedy, but about a little boy with eyes like morning and a heart that deserved more time. We posted pictures, not the ones that made people pity him, but the ones that made them like him. Henry with spaghetti sauce on his cheeks. Henry in his dinosaur pajamas. Henry trying to carry a pumpkin too big for him but refusing to give up. We wrote the truth. That the surgery could save him. That time was short. That his mother's parents had refused to help because their money was spoken for. We didn't mention them by name. We didn't have to. The contrast told the story. The fundraiser began to move. Not in a flood, but in a steady stream. $20 here. 50 there. Someone from my husband's old job gave 300 with a note, for the little boy who made everyone at the office smile in that Christmas photo. An old woman from our neighborhood contributed $10, and an apology that she wished it could be more. A stranger from another city donated 5 and wrote, "I lost mine. I hope you don't lose yours." Every notification was a smashing toward us in the dark. I watched the numbers climb and felt something unfamiliar. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the outline of it. Leo stayed until visiting hours ended. He left with a promise to be back early. And the kind of hug that said, "I am not leaving you alone in this." The next morning my parents called. Not to ask about Henry. Not to change their minds. My mother's voice was tight with frustration. "Did you post about us online?" she demanded. I closed my eyes. "I posted about the situation," I replied evenly. "I didn't use your names." "Well, people are talking," she snapped. "Your aunt called. Your cousins are sending messages. This is humiliating." Humiliating. The word burned. "My son is dying," I said quietly. Humiliation isn't high on my list of concerns. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "You're being dramatic," she said. "The doctors always exaggerate. And this public begging, it makes us all look desperate. You should have thought this through before having a child you couldn't afford to save." The nausea came so fast I had to grip the wall. I felt something shift inside me, a final audible crack in the fragile structure of my loyalty. "I did think it through," I replied, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I just didn't anticipate that his grandparents would put centerpieces ahead of his heartbeat." She sputtered, scandalized. "You don't understand the commitments we've made. Olivia's wedding is not just a party. It's an event. Contracts have been signed. Deposits paid. It's too late to cancel." "It wasn't too late to cancel when you changed caterers because the first one didn't understand your vision," I said. "It wasn't too late when you upgraded the venue. Or when you decided fireworks would be a magical touch. It just suddenly became too late when the cost was a surgery instead of a chandelier." Her silence crackled through the phone like static. "You're being cruel," she whispered finally. "No," I said. "I'm being clear." There was a long pause. Then, in a tone cooler than hospital tiles, she delivered her verdict. "If you're going to continue this circus online," she said, "we would appreciate you not including any mention of us. You know how easily things can be misunderstood." "Oh," I said softly. "I think they're being understood perfectly." She hung up. And for the first time in my life, the click of that disconnection felt less like abandonment and more like release. I stood there in the corridor for a long time, phone still in my hand, ears ringing with the echo of her words. Then I went back into Henry's room, where life and death were wrestling in the space of a few inches, where none of my parents' priorities mattered. where the only currency of any value was time. Leo arrived an hour later with a folder in his hand and exhaustion in his eyes. "I did it," he said, dropping into the chair. 43. "It'll clear by tomorrow morning at the latest." He rubbed his chest. "The manager said I'm crazy. I told him that makes two of us." I looked at him, at this man my parents had written off as irresponsible, and thought, "You are everything they are not." We refreshed the fundraiser page together. The total had climbed again overnight. 31,000 now. The comments section had turned into a small village of strangers who suddenly cared. We were close. Closer than we had any right to be. But the clock was still ticking. And the day the surgeon circled on the calendar, the last possible day to move ahead with the surgery, was approaching faster than either of us could slow it down. At night, when the hospital quieted to a low murmur, I sat beside Henry's bed and watched his chest rise and fall. Each breath felt like a fragile negotiation. "I'm trying," I whispered to him once. "I promise you. I'm trying as hard as I know how." The monitor screens glowed softly back at me. Numbers. Graphs. Lines. For the first time in my life I hated numbers. They had been my parents' language, their proof of success. Now they were the language of fear. Days blurred into each other. The fundraiser climbed. Leo's transfer cleared. My husband picked up every odd job he could find between hospital visits, as if pure effort could be converted into cash fast enough to outrun the clock. People dropped off envelopes at the nurse's desk. A janitor from the hospital slipped $50 into my hand without a word. A teenager organized a school bake sale after stumbling across Henry's story online. Humanity in its quiet ways showed up where family refused. And then the morning came when the total finally changed. 95,000. We had it. My breath left me in a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. I grabbed my husband's arm, pulling him toward the screen. Leo, who'd been half asleep in the corner chair, jolted awake at the commotion. "We did it," I choked. "We actually did it." Leo's eyes filled, and he turned away for a second, pretending to cough. When he looked back, he was smiling. "Told you," he said gruffly. "Some mountains move if enough people push." The surgeon came in an hour later. He'd already heard. The news travels fast when it carries hope. We signed papers with hands that shook. We listened to risks we'd already memorized. We watched as they gently prepared Henry to be taken to surgery. There is a special kind of terror in watching your child disappear behind double doors. They wheeled him down the hall, his small body swallowed by hospital linens. I walked beside the gurney until they told me I had to stop. I kissed his forehead, my lips lingering on his skin like I could transfer life through contact. "Come back," I whispered. Then the doors swung closed between us with a soft final sound. And in that moment, as the hallway emptied and the echoes faded, one thought rose above all the others in my mind, clear and sharp. Whatever happened next, nothing between my parents and me would ever be the same again. Because they had chosen their legacy, and now I was beginning to choose mine. The hours after they took Henry into surgery felt like being suspended between two worlds. The waiting room was too bright, too clean, too full of chairs that tried to mimic comfort, but didn't understand the needs of a breaking heart. My husband sat on one side of me, Leo on the other. We formed a small, uneven triangle of fear. None of us spoke much. Some silences are so heavy they do the speaking for you. Time didn't move normally. It drifted, then jolted, then settled again like it too was holding its breath. Nurses passed through with gentle smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Someone's phone vibrated. Someone sobbed softly in a corner. Lives were changing around us, but ours was paused in the longest second we'd ever lived. I stared at the double doors where they had taken him. The doors were metal, plain, utterly indifferent. They had swallowed my whole world behind their frame. Leo leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles looked white. "You know," he murmured, voice gravelly, "your father used to be terrified of doctors." I blinked at him, surprised by the unexpected story. "Yeah," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "When we were kids, he'd hide behind the shed if he even thought Mom was planning a checkup. One time I had to drag him out by the foot, while he screamed like someone was cutting his leg off. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Funny how people change. Or maybe they don't. It was a strange comfort hearing that. As if the man who had become so cold, so calculating, had once been a boy afraid of shots and bandages. As if the roots beneath the harshness were softer than the branches he'd grown. A memory flickered through my mind, my father teaching Olivia how to pose for photos, adjusting her chin and shoulders while ignoring the way I hovered nearby with a small trophy I'd won at a school contest. I tried to show him. He never turned. Do you think he cares? I asked suddenly. About any of this? Leo didn't pretend to soften the truth. I think your father cares about the world seeing him as the man he wants to be, he said quietly. I just don't think he ever figured out how to be the man the people who love him needed. It landed like a truth I'd known but never given shape to. A doctor walked through the door for another family, and my pulse jumped. When he turned left instead of toward us, my heart sank back into its restless rhythm. Minutes passed. Hours. At some point my phone vibrated. A message from Olivia. Mom is upset. She said you talked back to her yesterday. Are you okay? The casual tone detonated inside me like a quiet explosion. Was I okay? My son was in surgery because strangers and an outcast uncle had scraped life together for him. My parents were arranging cutlery designs and aisle decorations. And Olivia, whose wedding had become a monument, was asking if I had upset them. I turned the phone face down. Another hour melted away. The clock on the wall ticked with a sound that felt too sharp for such a fragile place. And then finally the doors opened. The surgeon stepped out, mask lowered, cap slightly askew with the evidence of long effort. His eyes scanned the room until they found us. I stood before he even spoke. My legs were shaking, but they held. He approached slowly, like someone carrying something delicate. Your son, he began, and the pause sliced through me. He breathed out. He made it. The surgery went well. The world shifted. For a long suspended second, none of us reacted. Not out of doubt, but because the human heart doesn't always remember how to receive mercy. Then my knees buckled. My husband caught me. Leo covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. Relief doesn't arrive gently. It floods. The doctor explained the details, how the defect had been repaired, how the next 48 hours would be critical, how recovery would be slow but promising. I heard every word, but they blended into a single truth. Henry was still here. I wanted to run down the hall and break through every barrier between us, but they told us he'd be moved to recovery soon. So we waited again, but this time the waiting felt like breathing after drowning. Leo stood up, rubbed his eyes roughly, and blew out a shaky breath. I'm gonna go wash my face, he said, voice cracking. Can't let the kid wake up thinking I'm a mess. I watched him walk away with a heaviness that didn't feel as heavy anymore. My phone lit up again. This time it was my father. Your mother is upset. You should apologize. I stared at the words, a hollow ringing in my ears. Apologize? For what? For saving my child's life? For challenging their indifference? For refusing to let my son die quietly while they threw petals down a silk aisle? My hand shook as I typed. Henry made it. The surgery was successful. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then reappeared. A strange dance of hesitation. Finally. Good. We're glad. But you still should not have made this a public matter. Olivia is very stressed. Very stressed. I felt something inside me snap quietly. Not a violent break. Just the final surrender of a rope stretched too thin for too long. The surgeon returned to tell us Henry was being moved to recovery, and we could see him. We followed him down the hall, through turns I barely noticed. The corridor lights reflected off the wax floor in long trembling lines. When we stepped into the recovery room, time stopped, small but alive. Alive in a way that felt louder than any machine in the room. His chest rose and fell with the help of tubes and monitors, but it rose. It fell. It continued. I touched his hand and felt warmth. That warmth was the climax of my life. Every fear, every wound, every sleepless night had led to this touch. My husband kissed Henry's forehead, tears falling freely now. Leo stood back, wiping his face, trying to pretend he wasn't crying. Look at him, Leo whispered. Fighting already. I sat beside the bed, my hand around his, my heart finally unclenching. And in that quiet, glowing room, surrounded by the machines that hummed like gentle guardians, I felt a realization bloom inside me like a truth that had been waiting for breath. Nothing my parents ever gave me, Not the house, not the schooling, not the carefully curated childhood, held even a fraction of the value of what Leo had just fought to give. Not money, not status, not approval. He gave us time. Time with our son. Time that my parents did not think was worth the cost. I leaned closer to Henry and whispered, "You're safe. We're here. We're not going anywhere." And under those soft hospital lights, something else settled inside me. A resolve. The next chapter of my life would not be written by the people who couldn't show up when it mattered. The people who chose elegance over empathy, spectacle over responsibility, a daughter when they needed applause, but not a granddaughter. Not a little boy whose only fault was being born into the wrong column of their ledger. That chapter was over. And as the final hours of the post-surgery night unfolded, with Henry stable and hope reborn, Act 3 ended on a truth that would shape everything to come. My parents had drawn a line. And for the first time in my life, I finally stepped onto the other side. The first night after the surgery, the hospital felt different. The walls hadn't changed, the lights still but the linoleum still shone with that false, over-sanitized sheen. But the air itself seemed to carry a new texture. Before, every sound had been a threat. Now every sound was simply life continuing. The beeping of monitors no longer sounded like countdowns. They sounded like heartbeat translations. Henry slept through most of it, his body exhausted from the war it had just survived. His cheeks still looked too pale, his eyelashes still rested too heavily against his skin, but his chest rose and fell with a rhythm that no longer felt like an argument with fate. It was a fragile rhythm, yes, but it was his. I sat in the chair beside his bed, my body aching in that deep way that comes from too many hours spent pretending you don't need rest. My husband had finally allowed himself to stretch out on the narrow couch along the wall, one arm draped over his eyes, the other hanging down as if he were still reaching for our son even in sleep. Leo had gone home reluctantly, promising to return in the morning with real food and a clean shirt for my husband, who looked like he had been wrung out and hung up to dry. The room dimmed to its nighttime setting, soft and quiet. I listened to the machines and felt my own heartbeat gradually lowering from a frantic gallop to something closer to a tired trot. Relief, it turns out, is not a gentle visitor. It crashes into you, leaving bruises of its own. I thought about the months that had led us here. The slow unraveling of our savings. The polite, measured refusals from institutions. The way strangers on the internet had shown more urgency than my own parents. And I thought about that last text from my father, telling me my mother was upset and that I should apologize. Apologize for what? For not letting my son die quietly? Outside the narrow window, the city lights glittered. People were having dinners, complaining about traffic, scrolling through their phones in bed. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably going over seating charts and tasting menus, discussing whether the gold-rimmed plates looked more elegant than the plain-bone china, arguing over whether the violinist should play something classical or modern for the bride's entrance. Their granddaughter's son had just survived heart surgery. Their world had not shifted an inch. In the morning, the nurse checked Henry's vitals and smiled, that special smile reserved for good signs in places where bad outcomes are always lurking nearby. She told me his numbers looked encouraging, stable, that he was responding well. I swallowed a sob of gratitude. After she left, I placed my head gently on the side of his bed for a moment, just to feel the nearness of him without wires and panic between us. My phone was full of notifications. Messages from people who had donated, from neighbors, from distant relatives who had seen the fundraiser and handwritten their shock into long paragraphs. There were messages from coworkers offering help, from my husband's old college friends checking in. Humanity, in all its imperfect glory, had shown up in pixels and polite visits and envelopes of folded bills. There were also messages from my parents that I hadn't opened. One from my mother. One from my father. 3 from Olivia. They sat there like unopened bills, things I knew would cost me something to face. I tapped my mother's first. The text expanded into a stream of words that felt more like a press release than concern. She was glad the surgery went well. She had always believed Henry would be fine. She felt hurt that I had made things public. She reminded me how much they had done for me my whole life. She said the family was whispering, that people were asking questions, that she didn't know how to answer without making it sound like I had exaggerated. She never asked how he was feeling. She never asked how I was holding up. She asked how it made them look. My father's message was shorter. He was relieved. He hoped we would now focus on moving forward, instead of revisiting difficult conversations. He mentioned that Olivia's wedding was approaching quickly, and that this negative attention was adding unnecessary stress. He suggested that, in the interest of family unity, I quietly adjust the fundraiser description and avoid any implication that help had been refused. He didn't even bother to pretend he cared more about his grandson's future than the optics of his daughter's big day. Olivia's messages were different. They were full of exclamation points and emojis, a strange mix of genuine emotion and oblivious privilege. She said she'd cried when our cousin told her the surgery was happening that day. She said she'd lit a candle on her vanity and prayed, even though she wasn't really religious, because it felt like the right thing to do. She said she was so glad God had come through and that this proved everything happens for a reason. Then she pivoted. She hoped there were no hard feelings. She hoped I understood Mom and Dad were under a lot of pressure with the wedding. She hoped I could take down anything that made them look heartless, because some of her friends had seen the fundraiser and were asking if it was about her parents, and it was awkward. The word sat there on the screen, small and absurd. Awkward. My son had been on the edge of death. They had chosen flowers and fireworks over him, and now the worst thing they could name was awkward. I didn't reply. Not yet. Words spoken in the heat of fresh hurt tend to scorch the wrong edges. I needed the fire to settle into something clearer, sharper. Not for their sake. For mine. Hours turned into days. Henry began to wake more, to focus his eyes, to grip our fingers with growing strength. His voice was faint when it finally emerged. A scratchy whisper that sounded like sand on stone, but it was his. His first question, of course, was not philosophical or profound. It was about his stuffed dinosaur, the one we'd left at home in the rush. My husband promised to bring it the next day, and for the first time since the diagnosis, I saw the faint shadow of a grin on Henry's face. Leo visited every day he could. Sometimes he brought soup in plastic containers, sometimes he brought stories to distract me. Sometimes he just brought his presence and a quiet companionship that required nothing in return. He sat with Henry and told him ridiculous tales about cars that refused to break down and wrenches that went on strike. The boy was too tired to laugh much, but he listened. Listening, I realized, is how children say thank you when words are beyond them. My parents did not visit. Not once. They did not ask which room he was in or whether children were allowed balloons, or if he liked a certain cartoon they could bring on a tablet. They did not offer to sit with him while we slept, or bring us a change of clothes, or leave a note at the front desk. What they did send was a single message from my mother, 3 days before Olivia's wedding. She wanted to confirm we would be attending. She had already given the coordinator our names for the seating chart. She said it would mean a lot to Olivia if we showed up, at least for the ceremony, even if we couldn't stay long. She used phrases like keeping the peace and family image, and not making things more complicated. My son still had 4 lines in his arms. His chest was held together with stitches. He startled in his sleep sometimes, tiny body jolting as if it remembered things his mind wasn't ready to understand. And my mother wanted to know whether we would be there in time to watch Olivia walk down the aisle to a string quartet. I stared at the message so long the words blurred. My husband saw my expression and asked what was wrong. I handed him the phone. He read it once, then again, and something in his face hardened that I had rarely seen there. He'd always been the soft one between us, the one who assumed misunderstandings over malice, the one who thought fences could be mended with enough conversation and patience. But now, tired and raw and protective in a way that had nothing to do with politeness, even he looked done. He placed the phone down on the table. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. "You don't owe them that. Guilt is a stubborn tenant. Even when thrown out, it hangs around outside the windows." Part of me still felt that familiar pull. The urge to be the good daughter. The reasonable one. The one who showed up, who smoothed things over, who made excuses so everyone else could stay comfortable. But another part of me, a part that had been slowly growing since the moment my father said, "We're already committed financially," was finally louder. We didn't owe them attendance. We didn't owe them a smiling backdrop for their performance. We didn't owe them the comfort of pretending this had just been a difficult time, an unfortunate misunderstanding, A regrettable miscommunication. They had made a choice. They had chosen where their loyalty lived. They had told the world through their actions what counted as too much. I drafted a reply more times than I could count. One version was full of rage. One was icy and polite. One was just a single word no. None of them felt right. Not because they weren't true, but because they didn't sound like the person I was trying to become on the other side of this. In the end, I wrote something simple. I told her we would not be attending. I told her our son's recovery required our full presence. I told her we wished Olivia no harm, but we could not stand beside people who had stepped away when our child needed them. I didn't try to make it gentle. I didn't wrap it in apologies. I let it stand the way truth stands when it decides to stop apologizing for existing. She didn't reply. Instead, Olivia did. Her message came an hour later, frantic and emotional. She begged me to reconsider. She said this would destroy Mom and Dad. She said people would talk. She said it was just bad timing that all of this had happened near her wedding. She reminded me how much our parents had sacrificed to give us both opportunities, over the fact that the scales had never been balanced between us. At the end, she wrote that if I didn't come, it would feel like I was trying to punish her for something that wasn't her fault. That line pierced me more than I wanted to admit. Because she was right, in a way. It wasn't her fault that she'd been made the center of their universe. She hadn't asked to be the princess of a kingdom built on appearances. She had simply grown up in a house where attention came to her like gravity, and no one had ever told her to question the pull. But my absence wasn't punishment. It was self-respect. It was tria. When a building is burning, you don't argue about drapes in the other wing. I set the phone aside and turned back to Henry. He looked smaller than all of this, and yet somehow larger too. His existence had become a moral mirror, reflecting everything back at us with cruel clarity. The day of the wedding arrived cloaked in sunshine. I knew this not from any invitation or reminder, but from the way my mother's social media filled with carefully curated images. A florist truck in the driveway, bridesmaids' dresses hanging in a row, blush and cream and expensive. A close-up of Olivia's hands, manicured and delicate, holding a bouquet so large it looked like it might swallow her whole. Every detail was documented and admired. The comments poured in. Beautiful. Perfect. Goals. A fairy tale. I scrolled through them in the glow of the hospital room, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic and something sweet from the cafeteria down the hall. I looked from my phone to my son, who dozed beneath a thin blanket, wires still a forest around him. Somewhere across town, champagne corks were popping. Guests were arriving in their best clothes. My parents were probably greeting people with practiced warmth, laughing at jokes that kept everything comfortably on the surface. There would be a string quartet. A photographer capturing candid moments that weren't candid at all. My father would likely give a speech about love and commitment and the importance of family. The word family would fall from his lips like a well-rehearsed line. Here in this room, family meant something else. It meant Leo sitting in a plastic chair with his knees too high, pretending the coffee was drinkable. It meant my husband adjusting the blanket 100 times just to have something to do with his hands. It meant nurses who had known us only days but spoke to us as if we had always belonged here. And me, a mother who had discovered the exact point at which her parents' love ran out. I put the phone away. I did not watch any more of the wedding through glass. I did not text congratulations. I did not send apologies. Instead, I held Henry's hand and told him a story about a tree outside our apartment that refused to shed all its leaves, even in the coldest weeks of winter. I told him some things just hold on, even when everything around them seems determined to let go. Later that evening, when the ceremony was surely over and the reception underway, my phone buzzed again. A single message from my father. He said he hoped I understood what a difficult position we'd put them in by not coming. Guests had asked where we were. People noticed. He said we had embarrassed the family. He said this was not how he had raised me to handle conflict. No mention of Henry. No question about his pain levels, his fear, the long months of rehab ahead. Just the sting of social discomfort, once again elevated above our survival. I read the message twice, let the disappointment settle into a calm I didn't recognize in myself, and then deleted it without replying. The act felt small and enormous at once. Over the next few weeks, lines hardened. Henry's recovery continued slowly, each tiny gain a quiet victory. He took sips of water without grimacing. He sat up for a few seconds longer each day. He let the nurses listen to his heart without looking afraid. His strength stitched itself back together with the same stubbornness that had carried him through surgery. We brought him home eventually to a living room rearranged for comfort instead of aesthetics. Pillows everywhere. Meds lying neatly in a basket. A chart on the fridge with times and doses. Our life shrank and expanded at once. Social lives, ambitions, old routines, all of it shifted to orbit around the simple fact that Henry was here and needed us fully. My parents did not come to see him. They did not drop off a meal or a card, or a lump of cash wrapped in an awkward apology. They did not stand in our doorway with remorse on their faces and the beginnings of an explanation. They did what they had always done when something didn't fit their script. They moved on without us. But in the quiet of our new life, with cartoons playing softly in the background and the dishwasher humming and Henry falling asleep with his dinosaur finally tucked under one arm, I realized something important. They weren't the center anymore. They weren't the gravitational force I had to constantly navigate. They were simply people I shared history with, who had failed a test they didn't even realize they were taking. And on the other side of that failure, something unexpected had grown. A different kind of family. A network of people who had proven in very practical ways that they believed my son's life was worth their inconvenience. The coworker who still checked in months later. The neighbor who mowed our lawn she had once judged for its dandelions. The mechanic who slipped $20 into an envelope with no return address, but a familiar grease stain on the corner. Leo, who kept showing up with the consistency of sunrise, never asking to be thanked. Act 4 was not just the fallout. It was the revelation. The realization that bloodlines and last names were not the only ways to define kinship. That the people who share your roots are not always the ones willing to water them when drought comes. And quietly, without fanfare, a promise began to form inside me like the first line of a new story. I would never, for the rest of my life, confuse grand gestures with love again. Love had shown up in small deposits, in shared risk, in sitting through the long nights of uncertainty. It had driven an old car across town to a hospital that wasn't expecting it. It had drained savings and canceled plans. It had picked up second jobs and baked cupcakes for strangers and signed checks with shaking hands. And somewhere, far from our apartment, my parents returned from a honeymoon of applause, convinced that the world still spun around the image they had created. One day, not too far from then, they would come knocking. They would arrive at my door with their own emergency, their own need, their own crisis of survival. And when that moment came, the memory of these days, the calls unanswered, the visits unscheduled, the money refused, would be waiting. Not burning. Not screaming. Just standing there like a closed door I was finally strong enough not to open. That was the quiet, escalating truth of Act 4. This wasn't just about what they had done. It was about who I was becoming because of it. Recovery rewrote the rhythm of our home. Slowed everything. Mornings were gentler, afternoons quieter, evenings spent tracking progress instead of chasing schedules. Henry grew stronger with the patience of a child who didn't yet understand how close he had come to disappearing. Some days he laughed easily. Other days he held his chest and whispered that it hurt. But every breath he took was a reminder of all the people who had helped pull him back to us. We learned to celebrate small victories. A longer walk down the hallway. A meal eaten without nausea. A night without alarms. Healing is rarely dramatic. It creeps in through steady inches, not leaps. Life settled into this new pattern, predictable in its fragility. And then without warning it shifted again. It began on a Saturday morning that smelled like pancakes. Henry sat on the couch building towers out of mismatched blocks, humming softly to himself. The light coming through the window painted the room in a warm, forgiving glow. My husband was washing dishes, the sound of running water a quiet background song. That was when my phone rang. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see for months. My mother. Instinct pushed my thumb toward decline, but habit, old and stubborn, stopped me. I took a breath and answered. Her voice wasn't polished. It wasn't distant. It wasn't wrapped in the posture she had perfected for social events. It was brittle, unsteady, almost unrecognizable. "Your father is in the hospital," she said. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. What? He collapsed in the driveway, she said. The ambulance came. They think it's his heart. The words cracked through me like sudden thunder. I didn't speak right away. I didn't know how to. She filled the silence with frantic breaths. They're running tests, she continued. They said he needs a procedure. Something with stents. I don't understand all of it. I closed my eyes. A cold truth slid into place. Her voice broke. I didn't know who else to call. The irony felt sharp enough to cut. I looked over at Henry. His little body bent forward in deep concentration, trying to balance the last block on his tower. His life had once rested on the edge of a number, a dollar sign, a decision. 95,000. Too much for them. Now my father's life had a price tag too. My mother kept talking. Her sentences ran together. Words about fear, doctors, upcoming tests, payments, insurance complications. They spilled out of her in a rush that reminded me of a house fire. She wasn't calm. She wasn't composed. She wasn't thinking about optics or appearances. She was a wife afraid of losing the man she had built her world around. And she needed me. The unfairness of it pressed against my ribs. When my son was fighting for his life, they had reviewed their finances like accountants. They had weighed his need against Olivia's dream wedding and chosen the wedding. They had looked at our desperation and found it inconvenient. Now they wanted something from me that they couldn't even name. Finally, my mother stopped speaking long enough for silence to stretch between us. Please, she whispered. Can you come? Her question hung in the air, trembling. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My husband stepped into the room, drying his hands on a towel. He watched my face, reading the shift in my expression the way only someone who has lived your every storm can. What's wrong? He mouthed. I didn't look away from the phone. Which hospital? I asked quietly. She told me. I nodded even though she couldn't see me and ended the call. For a long moment I just stood there. The sunlight on the floor. The smell of pancakes gone cool. The soft sound of Henry humming. All of it felt like a photograph I was stepping away from. My husband moved closer. Do you want me to come with you? I nodded again. He put on Henry's favorite movie, carried him to the bedroom, and got our sitter to come early. Her eyes widened when she saw our faces, but she didn't ask questions. Some emergencies explain themselves. The drive to the hospital felt heavy, familiar. A strange mirror of the journey we had taken not long ago. My mind replayed everything. The calls unanswered. The fundraiser ignored. My mother's irritation. My father's disappointment. The wedding. The speeches. The echo of my father saying I was dramatizing everything while my son lay pale and breathless. When we arrived, my mother sat in the waiting room with her purse clutched against her chest. She looked smaller. Fragile. Her carefully styled hair was flat on one side, her makeup streaked. The image of composure she had always had cracked open, revealing someone I didn't recognize. She stood when she saw me. Oh, thank God, she breathed. I didn't hug her. I didn't step forward. I didn't retreat either. I just stood there watching her try to gather herself. She looked at my husband, nodded stiffly, then turned back to me with eyes swollen from crying. They're not sure yet, she said. The doctor is coming with results. I'm so scared. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Where is he? She pointed down the hall. Room 214. I walked before she could follow. My husband stayed behind with her, offering the kind of conversation she could manage right now. I stepped through the doorway of my father's room and felt a strange pull in my chest. He looked smaller too. The man who once filled rooms with his presence now lay in a bed that made him look like a child caught in sheets too large for him. His face was pale, his lips drawn tight, his eyes closed. Lines of age I had never noticed ran across his forehead like cracks in old stone. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. The same sound that had become the soundtrack to Henry's survival. A nurse adjusted a drip line and gave me a sympathetic smile. Then she left us alone with the quiet. I stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment. This was the man who had chosen money over his grandson. This was the man who said 95,000 was too steep. This was the same man who had told me I was embarrassing the family by asking for help. And now he lay here, caught between beats, at the mercy of something bigger than pride or reputation. I took a slow breath and stepped closer. His eyelids fluttered, as if sensing movement. He opened them halfway, squinting to focus. When he recognized me, something flickered across his face. Relief, guilt, gratitude, pain. I couldn't name it. Maybe he couldn't either. You came, he whispered. Inside me, two truths collided. One truth said, he's your father. The other said, he was not a grandfather when it mattered. He reached out a trembling hand. Not far. A few inches. Enough to ask without speaking. I didn't move to take it. Not yet. I needed to hear something first. Why now? I asked quietly. Why call me now? His eyes filled with water he didn't let fall. Because I need you. The sentence lit something sharp inside me. A realization. A turning point the story had been threading toward since the beginning. He needed me. When I had needed him, he was busy choosing table linens. A breath I'd been holding for months finally escaped me. I took a seat in the chair beside his bed and folded my hands in my lap. I'm here, I said softly. But things are not the same anymore. The truth settled between us like a third presence. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded, as if suddenly aware that the world he'd built was made of thin material. As if he could feel, even in his weakened state, that this moment was defining something. The doctor came in then, carrying charts and gravity. He spoke in measured tones about arteries, blockages, risks, and urgent procedures. My mother reached the doorway as he spoke, one hand pressed to her mouth, her breath shaky. He needed a surgery. He needed it soon. Insurance would cover some, but not all. A familiar number hovered in the air, unspoken but understood. A number that echoed another number from months before. A number that closed the circle. My mother looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. We can't afford the rest, she whispered. Not after the wedding. We don't have anything left. My father stared at the ceiling, silent. And just like that, they were standing where I had stood. In the exact position. With the exact fear. Facing the exact decision. They didn't say the words, but they needed help. They needed me. And the universe finally had placed the scales in my hands. This was the turning point, not revenge. Not triumph. Just clarity. The final line of Act 5 wrote itself inside me with a calm I didn't expect. Now they understood the cost of choices. And this time, I would be the one who decided how the story moved forward. When the doctor left the room, the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy. A silence crowded with the weight of every choice that had brought us all here. My father lay as still as a fallen statue, his chest rising with a fragile rhythm. My mother stood at the foot of his bed, fingers trembling around the strap of her purse as if holding it tighter could hold her world together. I stood between them in a way I had never wanted to be. Not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as the person fate had placed at the crossroads. For a moment, neither of them spoke. My mother's breathing was uneven. My father stared at the ceiling like he was afraid the truth would shatter if he looked directly at me. My husband appeared in the doorway, watching quietly, giving me space to choose. He knew not all choices need partners. Some must come from the deepest part of who you are becoming. My mother broke first. We don't have the money, she whispered, voice cracking like thin glass. Everything went into the wedding. Everything. I told them it was too much, but your father, he wanted it perfect. He said you only get married once. He said appearances matter. He thought we'd have time to rebuild our savings. Her eyes were wide and wet, reflecting layers of fear she was not used to carrying. I studied her, realizing something that unsettled me. She wasn't lying. She wasn't performing. For the first time in her life, she was showing real fear, real vulnerability. It should have softened me. But reflection is a mirror, not a blanket. She had stood in this exact ago, at a crossroads between compassion and comfort, between family and image, between her grandson and her daughter's wedding. And she had chosen image. I felt a tremor move through me as my mind replayed everything. My father's voice saying too much. My mother's text about humiliation. Olivia's plea for appearances. The silence when we begged for help. The coldness when they justified their refusal. The way they moved on as if Henry's fight had been a minor inconvenience. And now they looked at me with eyes that begged. Can you help us? My mother finally asked, her voice barely audible. Please. I don't know what to do. My father turned his head at that slowly, painfully. His gaze met mine, and what I saw there wasn't anger, or pride, or the dismissive superiority he so often wielded. It was fear. Raw, unprotected fear. Ironically, it was the same fear I had carried alone while he calculated numbers and prioritized decorations. He swallowed hard. His voice when it came was rough. "This isn't how I wanted things to be." I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because words didn't come easily when the truth pushed so hard against my chest. He blinked slowly, as if summoning courage from a place he hadn't visited in years. "I made mistakes," he said. "The understatement of a lifetime. But you're strong," he whispered. "You didn't let anything stop you. I don't know how you did it." The praise should have felt healing. Instead it felt late. Thin. Like trying to tape together a fractured bone long after it has healed crooked. My husband stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. He didn't speak, but the warmth of his touch steadied me. I looked at my father, really looked at him. For years he was a man of neat edges, polished shoes, controlled tones. But lying there, stripped of dignity, stripped of power, stripped of his own vulnerability, he looked human. Too human. It scared me how easy it could be to slip into bitterness. To look at this moment as revenge. To think now you know. Now you feel it. Now you understand what too much really costs. But something inside me resisted. Not because I wanted to forget. Not because I wanted to absolve them. And definitely not because they deserved kindness. It was because Henry deserved better from me. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the tangle of feelings swirling inside. Anger, hurt, grief, disappointment, compassion, and something heavier, the knowledge that whatever I did next would define the rest of my life. I didn't want to be cruel simply because cruelty had been done to me. I didn't want to turn into a mirror of their worst choices. But I also didn't want to let them mistake my compassion for weakness. Finally, I opened my eyes. My mother stepped closer, clasping her hands. "Please, honey," she whispered. "Your father, he needs this surgery." I nodded slowly. "I know." She exhaled in shaky relief, as if that single acknowledgement meant I had agreed. It didn't. "I'm not here to punish you," I said quietly. "But I'm not here to erase what happened either." My mother's lips quivered. "We said things we shouldn't have. We were overwhelmed. The wedding." "Stop." I held up a hand gently, not harshly. "This isn't about the wedding anymore." She stared at me, confused. "This is about choices," I continued. "And accountability. And the fact that you made it very clear where your priorities were." My father closed his eyes. I let the truth settle into the room. "I'll help," I said. Both of them inhaled sharply. "But not the way you think." My mother's brows knit. "What do you mean?" I looked between them with a calmness I didn't expect from myself. "I'll make sure the hospital gets what it needs so he can have the won't be giving you cash. And I won't be covering everything." My mother blinked. "But I will make sure he survives," I said. "I'm not here to let him die." Emotion rose in my father's eyes. Gratitude, shame, maybe a mix of both. "Thank you," he whispered. "But," I continued, "I'm not responsible for fixing your life, or your finances, or the consequences of your choices." My mother stiffened. "This is temporary," I said. "This is compassion, not restoration." A slow, stunned silence filled the room. My husband stepped closer beside me, nodding with quiet agreement. My father swallowed. "I understand." The humility in his tone surprised me so deeply, I didn't know how to stand with it. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She lowered her head, defeated in a way I had never seen. In that moment, reflection hit me like a gentle but unmovable truth. Forgiveness wasn't a reset button. Forgiveness was a boundary that kept the past from repeating itself. And compassion wasn't letting someone back in. Compassion was simply refusing to become what hurt you. I took a breath and said the final thing they weren't prepared to hear. "After the surgery, after the recovery, we will need space. Real space. A long time." My mother looked up sharply. "How long?" "I don't know," I said. "But long enough that I can look at you without remembering that my son almost died while you worried about centerpieces." My father flinched, but he didn't argue. "She's right," he whispered to my mother. Let Let her do what she needs, the doctor returned, breaking the moment. He spoke clinical words about scheduling and risks. Words that only hours ago had belonged to Henry. Words that had once been the price of our fear. As the doctor left again, my father reached a trembling hand toward me once more. Not out of obligation. Not out of love that remained intact. But out of something different, something shaped by pain, by maturity, by grief, by growth. I held his hand for only a moment before letting it go. And as I walked out of his room with my husband beside me, I realized what Acts 6 truly meant. This wasn't about choosing between cruelty or forgiveness. It was about becoming the kind of person who could hold both truth and grace without letting either one consume them. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my parents. I was choosing myself. The morning of my father's procedure arrived quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not tense, just quiet, like the world was pausing long enough to let us hear ourselves. Hospitals have a way of flattening everyone to the same level. No titles. No reputations. No curated images. Just people stripped down to their most human selves. My mother sat in the waiting area clutching a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her hands shook too much for the liquid to settle. She kept glancing at me as if waiting for permission to speak. I didn't offer it, but I didn't shut the door either. My husband sat beside me reading through some forms Henry's doctor had given us earlier in the week. Even he seemed subdued, as though the echoes of our past fear were still circulating through the air. When the nurses came for my father, he gave me a look that held more emotion than he'd ever shown me growing up. It wasn't pride or authority. It wasn't disappointment or control. It was gratitude. Naked. Unmasked. Painfully sincere. For a moment I saw him the way I had seen Henry, someone who needed help, not judgment. Someone who was vulnerable, not invincible. Someone whose life could disappear in a breath. Then they rolled him away. My mother crumbled the moment his bed disappeared around the corner. A slow collapse, like a tower finally giving in to gravity. She sank into a chair, hands covering her face, letting out a sob she'd probably been holding for decades. I stood there, unsure how to respond. I wasn't stone. I wasn't unfeeling. But compassion didn't erase memory, and empathy didn't rewrite history. After a moment my husband went to her, just a hand on her shoulder, and she accepted it. Maybe she knew I couldn't do that for her yet. Maybe she understood why. The surgeon's timing was almost uncanny. He walked in with the purposeful calm of someone who has spent a lifetime balancing hope against uncertainty. "We'll take good care of him," he said. "It will take some time." Time. That word again. The currency of life. The resource none of us controlled. When he left, the air settled into a long, heavy stretch of waiting. Waiting brings out the truth in people. It strips away the noise. It leaves only what's real. My mother spoke first. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't turn right away. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I didn't trust how her words might land. When I finally looked, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Hair undone, face blotched, hands trembling. For the first time, she looked like someone life had pushed too far. "I should have been there for you," she said, voice cracking. "For him. For Henry." I didn't reply. She kept going, words spilling from her like water from a cracked vase. We thought the wedding would bring the family together. We thought it would make everything feel complete." She shook her head. "We were wrong. I was wrong." She wiped at her face clumsily. "Your father, he was so proud of how we raised you girls. He wanted to give Olivia a perfect day. But we lost sight. We lost track of the real things." Still I didn't speak. "I know you don't want excuses," she said, her voice softer. "And you're right. Nothing we say will make what we did okay." She hesitated. "But I didn't think we would lose him. I didn't think the worst could happen." Pain flickered in her eyes like a broken light. I didn't want to believe something that terrible was possible. Finally I inhaled. "My worst happened," I said quietly. "And neither of you believed it until strangers did." She looked down, ashamed. "I know," she whispered. "I'll carry that." There was nothing more to say. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. The sky outside drifted from morning brightness to afternoon haze. My thoughts wandered between Henry at home with the sitter and my father behind closed doors, chest opened, heart exposed to tools and hands that worked miracles quietly. During a lull, Leo arrived. He slipped into the waiting room with his familiar oil-stained jacket and a small bag of food under his arm. When he saw my mother, his expression tightened. Not cruel, just guarded. My mother stiffened. "Leo," he nodded with cold politeness. "You look well." She flinched at the sarcasm but didn't respond. Maybe she knew better than to pick this battle. He moved to sit beside me. "We good?" he asked softly. "Yeah," I whispered. "We're good." His presence steadied everything. At one point, stepping away from the others, I found myself staring out the window. Cars passed below. People walked by with coffees and grocery bags. Life was happening, indifferent to the way mine felt suspended. I tried to imagine what kind of daughter I wanted to be now. Not the obedient one. Not the invisible one. Not the angry one either. Something else. Something new. I thought about Henry, his tiny body fighting so fiercely for life. I thought about how his survival had rewritten everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family. And then it hit me with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Strength didn't mean shutting people out. Strength meant knowing who to let in and how to punish my parents to heal. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to suffer the way I had suffered. I just needed boundaries. Firm ones. Ones that protected my peace without becoming a prison for my heart. My father's surgery lasted 4 hours. Then 5. Then almost 6. Time stretched until it felt foreign. The surgeon finally emerged, mask off, eyes tired but calm. "It went well," he said. My mother cried for real this time, raw, unfiltered tears that had nothing to do with appearances. My father would recover. Slowly. Carefully. But he would live. Relief washed over me in a way I didn't expect. Genuine relief. Not because he deserved it more than anyone else, but because losing him now would have complicated my healing in ways I wasn't ready to face. We visited him once he woke, only briefly. His voice was rasped, thin, barely there, but when he saw me, he reached out again, weakly, instinctively. And this time I didn't hesitate. I took his hand just for a heartbeat or two. "I'll be okay," he whispered. "I know," I said. But inside a deeper truth formed. We wouldn't be going back to who we were. We would be moving forward into who we needed to be. Separately. Carefully. Slowly. And for the first time since all of this began, the resolution took its first breath. Not reconciliation. Not revenge. Just clarity. And that clarity became the bridge into what came next. Because boundaries weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning of the version of my life I could finally claim as my own. The week after my father's surgery unfolded like a slow exhale. Not peaceful, not perfect, just slower, steadier, quieter. My father remained in the hospital for monitoring, and my mother stayed by his side with a devotion that surprised me. She brought him broth, adjusted his pillows, called the nurses more often than necessary. Loyalty she'd shown at social gatherings. It was real. Messy. Exhausted. Human. And that alone told me something was shifting. But shifts don't erase what came before. They only make room for new truths to land. At home, Henry's recovery began to find its own rhythm. He tired easily, but he smiled more. The color returned to his cheeks. He asked questions again. Child questions. Questions about dinosaurs and juice flavors and why the moon sometimes followed the car at night. His innocence remained intact, untouched by the storm that had nearly taken him. Watching him, I felt something loosen inside me. A long-held fear. A tightness that had wrapped itself around my ribs for months. His laughter sounded like a future I hadn't dared to imagine. My husband and I found small moments of peace together too. We talked less about bills and more about the little things. New shows, silly conversations, the way Henry's hair kept curling at the ends. We learned to exist again without living on a cliff's edge. Leo came over often, always with a reason. An oil change reminder, a new wrench he wanted my husband to see, a leftover sandwich from a diner he insisted we help finish. He never stayed long. Never imposed. Just showed up enough to remind us that family could be chosen, shaped, nurtured. He became the quiet redemption of this story. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the living room, my husband turned to me and asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "What are you going to do about your parents?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched Henry build towers again, carefully stacking each block, adjusting them, frowning when they leaned too far to one side. He worked in silence, a tiny architect trying to understand balance. Balance. That was the thing I had been searching for without knowing how to name it. Not reconciliation. Not estrangement. Not forgiveness tied neatly with a bow. Balance. I think I finally said that I need space. Real space. And I need to build that without explaining it or defending it. My husband nodded slowly. And them. I exhaled. They can be part of our life again someday, but only if they learn to show up. Truly show up. Not with money. Not with apologies shaped like performances. But with presence. Presence is a currency that can't be bought. And my parents had never learned how to spend it. But the truth was this: I wasn't responsible for teaching them. 2 days later, my father asked to see me. Alone. I hesitated, but I went. Not because I owed him anything, but because the version of myself I was becoming needed to see this through. When I entered his room, he was sitting up, pale but stronger. He looked older, smaller, quieter. The machinery around him hummed a low chorus as if holding the moment together. He gestured for me to sit. "I've been thinking," he started. My chest tightened. Conversations that begin with those words rarely ended where you expect. "I have lived a very structured life," he said. "Everything in order. Everything neat. I believed good choices made good outcomes. I thought responsibility meant control. And I thought love was something you showed through stability, through giving, through planning." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I didn't plan for this. And I didn't give when you needed me. And I didn't love in a way that made you feel safe." The confession landed heavy, not because of how dramatic it was, but because it felt true. He took a shaky breath. "I was wrong." For a moment, the room felt too quiet. He continued, voice trembling. "When you were a child, I focused on providing. On building a life that looks successful. I thought if I could give you and Olivia a certain kind of world, it would make everything easier. But somewhere along the way, I confused sacrifice with distance, with silence." My father, who had never apologized for anything in his life, not for missed recitals, not for harsh words, not for choosing work over birthdays, was unraveling in front of me with a vulnerability I didn't know he possessed. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said. "Not to erase what happened. Not to fix it. But because I should have said it sooner. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I simply listened." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once signed checks for Olivia's wedding, the same hands that once brushed off my pleas. "Do you hate me?" he asked softly. The question was so small, so fragile, I almost didn't recognize it coming from him. "No," I said. "I don't hate you." He nodded slowly, as if bracing for the next blow. "But I don't trust you," I added gently. "Not yet." The honesty didn't wound him. It released him. Maybe it was the relief of not being lied to. Maybe it was the comfort of knowing the path ahead was real, not rushed. Maybe it was the understanding that rebuilding required broken pieces acknowledged, not hidden. "We can start there," he whispered. And for the first time in years, I believed him. Later that evening, as I walked through the quiet hallway toward the elevator, something inside me settled. A truth, not shiny or dramatic, just simple. Redemption wasn't about restoring what once was. Redemption was about building something new from the pieces that remained. That night, back at home, I tucked Henry into bed. He held his dinosaur close, eyelids heavy but peaceful. I watched him breathe and felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude move through me. We had been through a storm. We had been broken in places. But we were not lost. As I closed his bedroom door, I understood the deeper arc of everything we'd lived. My parents had shown me who they were. But life had shown me who I was becoming. And the redemption wasn't theirs. It doesn't apologize for moving forward. It doesn't slow itself down to let you process things neatly. It simply carries you moment by moment, until one day you look up and realize the landscape around you has changed. Not because you forced it, but because healing has its own quiet schedule. In the months that followed, life rebuilt itself in small, deliberate ways. Henry grew stronger. His cheeks filled out again. His laughter returned like a song that had been stuck behind clouds. We spent afternoons at the park, watching him run with a cautious freedom. People assumed he was just a playful child, and that was the beauty of it. His battle wasn't visible anymore. It lived only in the way we watched him a little more closely, held him a little tighter, cherished him a little louder. My husband and I found a new rhythm too. A softer one. A more attentive one. The kind that forms after shared trauma, when you've both stood on the edge and learned the cost of losing. We didn't say I love you more, we just lived it more clearly. As for my parents, their lives did not return to the shining image they once curated. My father recovered slowly. His strength returned in pieces, like fragments of a former self trying to assemble into something more grounded. He was quieter now, reflective. Sometimes he called to check on Henry. Sometimes he didn't call at all, afraid, I think, of saying the wrong thing. But when he did reach out, he chose his words carefully, like someone practicing a language he'd never taken seriously before. My mother struggled with the new boundaries. At first she tried to sweep things under the rug, carrying gifts and small peace offerings to our doorstep, as if kindness purchased in boutiques could bandage what had been broken. But I didn't open the door. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply didn't participate. Space was not a punishment. It was part of the healing. For me. And maybe eventually for them. She learned slowly, reluctantly, that this time I meant what I said. There would be no return to the old family script. Not the one where I played the quiet daughter who forgave by default. Months passed. My father started sending letters, handwritten, uneven but honest. Sometimes they were simple updates. Sometimes they were reflections on his life, the wedding, the choices he once thought were right. My mother eventually sent a letter too. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was the first letter in her entire life that didn't mention appearances, or family image, or expectations. She wrote about fear instead. About shame. About regret. The real kind. The unpolished kind. I didn't respond right away. Truth needs time to settle before you can build anything on top of it. Henry asked about them occasionally. Children sense absences. He didn't know the depth of the story. He only knew his grandparents used to be more present. I told him sometimes grown-ups need to learn lessons too. He accepted that answer with the simplicity that only a child's heart can offer. Leo remained a constant. If there was a corner wrench in our home that needed adjusting, he was suddenly there. If we needed a meal, he pretended he had accidentally cooked too much. If Henry wanted company, he told him stories that made even my husband laugh. He never asked for praise. He never reminded us of what he had done. He simply lived like someone who believed showing up was the only real language family needs. And that, quietly, steadily, became the truth of our life. Family wasn't the people who shared our blood. It was the people who showed up when it mattered. Eventually, my father asked to see Henry. Not through my mother. Not through guilt. Through honesty. He said if I wasn't ready, he understood. I waited a long time before answering. Weeks. Maybe months. And one afternoon, sitting on the edge of Henry's bed while he rearranged his dinosaurs, I realized something. Letting my father see Henry wasn't about giving him a second chance. It was about giving myself closure. So I agreed. We met in a quiet corner of a park. My father looked smaller than I remembered, humbled in ways that years could never have accomplished on their own. He bent down slowly, cautiously, and said hello to Henry. My son looked up at him with the openness of someone who hadn't learned bitterness yet. And when Henry smiled, my father broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crumble around the eyes, like a man relieved to be given a moment he no longer felt entitled to. My mother came along too, but stayed further back, as if approaching too quickly might undo the fragile truce. She didn't take photos. She didn't comment on Henry's outfit. She didn't reach for me. She sat on a bench and watched. Maybe she finally understood the cost of silence. Maybe she understood the cost of choosing wrong. Maybe she understood that healing wasn't hers to demand. And that was enough. We stayed only 15 minutes. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a beginning. A small one. Cautious one. But it was enough to close the circle. As we left the park, my father touched my arm lightly. "Thank you," he whispered. And I believed him. Not because the past had been erased. Because both of us were choosing something honest in its place. Walking back to the car with Henry's little hand in mine, I knew something quietly powerful. I wasn't carrying a grudge anymore. But I wasn't carrying guilt either. I was carrying clarity. And clarity is the closest thing to peace I had ever known. My parents spent $250,000 on my sister's wedding, but refused to save my son's life for $95,000. I thought that choice would define me forever. But life has a way of circling back with truth, offering each of us a different kind of mirror. They saw what loss feels like. I learned what strength feels like. And in the end, I realized something simple. Some hearts grow after they break. Some families do too. And some never will. But mine, the one I chose to build, finally found peace.